Thank you so much for joining us at the Hidden Histories Collective, formerly known as the American Aboriginals. We are super, super excited to be sharing this particular presentation with you guys. And as you can see, it is called You Were Never Black. And, this presentation has been long in coming. As you guys know, I do talk a great deal about education, and I've done that in various videos that we've shared here. But this one in particular is going to give you guys a really, really deep dive into the origins of things and putting it together in a kind of collective space so that you guys can see it. So again, we're going to dive right in and just start talking about this in a very candid way. And, just to give you guys a bit of the contents, we're going to be focusing on the Department of Education, the latest on that, the General Education Board, the philosophy of the GEB, and then we'll be segging into the boarding schools, also known as HBCUs. We're going to definitely be talking about Julius Rosenwall, which is very, very key here because you can't talk about education without talking about the Rosenwald schools. We're also going to be talking about the Black towns and settlements. I'm going to be showing you guys some causal connections to that as well. And then we'll be sharing final thoughts. So yeah, let's just dive in. So as you guys probably know, there's been a lot of chatter in the news about President Donald Trump's executive order basically dismantling the U.S. Department of Education as we know it. And that executive order was signed on March 20th, 2025. And what he basically did was, he told his education secretary, look, let's go ahead and just start the process of dismantling the department as a whole. And that is what has been happening. And part of that means transferring some of the functions of the U.S. Department of Education to other federal agencies, and as well as primarily giving educational authority back to the states and local communities. And so, of course, this has caused a bit of furor across the country. With let's see, there was about 1,300 layoffs. They've also had, judges trying to stop that. And quite frankly, I don't know how they're going to do that because, it is an executive order and it can be done. I think once the ball starts rolling, some things can be reversed about it, but I don't know how much. We will definitely be following this story very, very closely. But the bottom line is individual states are going to have to figure out what to do now that federal funding is going to be cut significantly. And that means that there's going to be a lot of, if you will, agenda like dynamics that are going to be changing throughout the country from state to state. So to give you guys examples of certain things, I guess you could say when we had past tense, the U.S. Department of Education, there were certain federal education mandates and reporting that needed to happen if you were receiving funding from the federal government, i.e., DC. As you guys know, there was the No Child Left Behind Act. Then there was the Every Student Succeeds Act. Then there was the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And there's also Title I, which focused primarily on elementary and secondary education, particularly for low income students. We also had civil rights compliance. We had English language learner standards. And as you can see, the list goes on and on and on about what reporting meant for each of the individual states. So if you were receiving funding from the federal government, all these different mandates were necessary and you needed to report on them, and you have to report on them to be compliant, basically. And not to say that these particular mandates there's anything wrong with them. I think that every state will tell you that they felt challenged by having to meet some of these mandates, and it was really challenging. But it will be interesting. And of course, because of these mandates, because of these pressures, states were not always meeting their goals, and they weren't always able to move the needle when it came to raising test scores and raising performance. So it's going to be really interesting to see how individual states handle this, because certain things are going to fall off the table, and that's just a reality because there's not funding in place, or there will be much more reliance on individual donors and organizations to make things happen. So, but I just wanted to give you guys a general overview as to what that looks like, what it's looking like now. And it will take some time before the Department of Education is fully, quote unquote, dismantled. We might not see that for another year or so, 2026, 2027, but things are in place to make that happen right now. So, the precursor to the U.S. Department of Education is the General Education Board. And many of you may have heard of this particular entity. But now, what we see here is when you look at when the Education Board was founded, it was founded not right after, but after the Civil War, after Reconstruction. And what the General Education Board was comprised of was an elite group of industrialists, economists, university presidents, and philanthropic strategists who shared a vision for shaping American education, particularly as it related to the South and among Black populations. Okay. So, what the GEB did was oversaw rural white and Black schools in the South, as well as the modernization of farming practices. So, what they basically were doing was just trying to consolidate all these different states, all these different farms across the country, and really saying, okay, what is the standard here? How are we going to ensure that pretty much everybody does things the right way, and they do it in a way that isn't going to cost farmers, cost the economy, cost production and productivity. So I want to show you some of the key figures here because this is really, really important to understand the General Education Board and who they were. Of course, the primary figure of that board was John D. Rockefeller. Now, John D. Rockefeller was incredibly, incredibly wealthy. He owned the Standard Oil Company, now known as ExxonMobil, and he donated 1 million to the cause when the board was first formed. So you can say in many ways he spearheaded that effort. Now, along with his wife Laura Spelman, you could say that the Rockefeller family would give over $180 million to fund the board, and that's $1.4 trillion in today's dollars. $180 million. Incredible, right? So, yes, this is the same Laura Spelman, where the college, Spelman College, was named after her. And as you can see, she was a mixed race woman. So I'll just put that out there. And then the chairman of the General Education Board was Frederick T. Gates. And he's also the author of The Country School of Tomorrow, which we'll be diving into that a little bit. And there's been some speculation as to whether Frederick T. Gates is actually related to Bill Gates of Microsoft. Um, I don't know that for a fact, and I won't speculate because I haven't done any genealogy research to confirm or deny that. But they do share the same last name, and even if they are related, okay, what do we do with that information? What we now know is that these particular individuals were very instrumental in shaping the education as we know it. Okay. We also had Reverend Dr. Wallace Buttrick, and he was the first secretary and executive officer of the GEB, and he became president in 1917. Now, Buttrick also he had a really interesting career, and I wouldn't necessarily say, and you can do research on him too, but I wouldn't necessarily say that he was part of the elite. He became part of the elite, but that's not how he started out. Now, before he became the executive officer of the GEB, he was interestingly the first director of the newly formed China Medical Board in 1914. And that was a U.S. organization devoted to modernizing the Chinese medical system. So I'll just throw that out there. Okay, just put that out there for you guys. Now, the other key figure was George Foster Peabody. And you guys know that Peabody name, you've heard it several times. He was also a banker and a philanthropist. Now, Peabody was a co-founder, director, and treasurer of the GEB. And from 1914 to 1921, he served on the board of directors of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. Okay, so you're talking about some incredibly powerful people shaping education as we know it, but particularly shaping the education of poor white and black farmers and individuals in the South. Now, of course, here we have the infamous Booker T. Washington. Now, Washington wasn't a board member, but he was heavily involved in shaping GEB's direction on Black education. Now, as you guys know, Booker T. Washington was the founder of Tuskegee Institute, and he was instrumental in anything related to Black education. And of course, some people will call him many different things. I don't like to name call, but I will say he definitely was instrumental in shaping many of the educational dynamics that we see today. So, so here's the interesting part here, and you guys have probably seen videos where I've referenced this philosophy, but I think it's really, really important that I shape this again because I think we've got to really let this live in us, because if we don't, we'll continually say, "Oh well, it's not a biggie." It is a biggie. So let's talk about the philosophy of the GEB. Now, I know this is kind of a blurry copy, but I wanted to show you guys this, that it actually came from the Country School of Tomorrow, which was written by Frederick T. Gates. Now, this is an interesting part of the philosophy, and I'm going to read a bit of it to really put it in context for you guys. So, this is Frederick T. Gates writing: "Is there aught of remedy for this neglect of rural life? Let us at least yield ourselves to the gratifications of a beautiful dream that there is. In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall not try to make these people, or any of their children, into philosophers or men of learning or of science. We are not to raise up from among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply." So I don't have to reread it again, but let that sit for you guys for a minute. Let it sit for a minute, because they're basically saying we don't need them to be anything other than workers. Point blank, period. So what you see here with their philosophy is they were using education basically as social control. And education was not about liberating or uplifting individuals, but shaping them into compliant citizens to serve the needs of the social industrial order, period. The board also believed that rural populations, especially in the South, were in need of retraining to serve the agrarian economy effectively. And what that basically means is that when you look at the different farms and you look at the different ways that farm life was made, there wasn't necessarily continuity. All farms were different. Everyone was kind of doing their own thing, and there wasn't really one way of doing things. And so they really wanted to consolidate and make sure that everybody was doing things the right way, with the right equipment, in the right format, if you will, all of those things. So they, the GEB wanted to ensure that farms were all run pretty much the same. And this also contributes to the growth of the economy, because essentially, if you're saying to farmers they have to use this type of equipment, then that means you're going to make more of those types of materials and equipment to facilitate that process. Now, they also, of course, the GEB did not think that rural people needed to even worry about anything intellectual. All it was about was practical versus intellectual education. The GEB explicitly rejected the idea of promoting liberal arts, critical thinking, or higher education, especially for the poor and African Americans. It just didn't. It wasn't a part of their purview, as you saw from the philosophy. Instead, they emphasized manual labor, agriculture, domestic science, and industrial training. That's it. In other words, the GEB sought to educate the working class to remain the working class. Now, their vision, okay, so like with all things, you have your philosophy, then you have your grand vision of how you're going to execute these things. So the GEB, their philosophy, they just wanted to promote the idea that rural and Black families were incapable of educating their children properly, and thus needed elite, scientifically trained experts to redesign their world. So, in other words, you're not even capable of running your life. We will do everything. You just follow what we tell you. That's it. And the GEB envisioned a permanent underclass trained to fulfill economic roles defined by industrial and agricultural elites, not to become leaders or thinkers at all. Now, I want you guys to really look at this photo here. I found this on one of the, I think it was the Library of Congress. This was out of Calhoun County in Alabama. Now, look at their faces. These are really interesting looking, quote unquote, Black women, right? um, yeah, I always look at photos because the photos tell the story too. So yeah, that was the vision of the GEB. Now, the implications of this vision meant that they funneled millions of dollars into HBCUs and the Black rural schools. Millions. And they prioritized industrial vocational training over academic or professional development. And the idea of fitting people for their place replaced the Jeffersonian ideal of education as a tool for civic engagement and self-governance. Now, most of that came later. Now, we could say now we go to college, we definitely, it's all about liberal arts. It's all about getting people to think critically. It's all about getting people to see a way for themselves beyond just using their hands, right? But that came much later. And of course, that type of education was reserved for certain colleges like Yale and your Harvards. But when it comes to the Tuskegee Institutes and things of that nature, it was very, very different. Very different. That came later. Okay, so now let's dive into the boarding schools. I want to really talk about that because I want to show you guys how people became indoctrinated. Now, we all know this, but I think when you see the origins of it and you see that it became deeply embedded into our educational system, it was really hard to reverse that. So, but I want to first talk about how the boarding schools came to be, or as we know them. Now, when I say boarding schools, I mean schools where you lived and you got educated. And some people will call them Indian boarding schools. Some people will call them HBCUs. But they're all, to me, I just say they're boarding schools. Now, the first, I guess you could say, formalized kind of boarding schools were really in the form of religious schools. And the first one that we know of really is the Foreign Mission School, and that operated from 1817 to 1826 in Cornwall, Connecticut. Now, the school was established by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, and the ABC FM was focused on sending missionaries to non-Christian cultures, mostly overseas. So when you think of these mission schools, or these, I guess you can say, seminaries, you'll begin to see that there is a thread across the board. And the thread was to ensure that those students of non-Christian cultures were to be taught Christianity and Western culture so that they might become missionaries to their own peoples. Okay? So in order to make this plan work, you had to take the people from that particular culture, that particular tribe, that particular community, and take them out of it, and then re-educate them so that they can go back and teach the very thing that you're teaching them to their people and their communities. Okay? I know I said a mouthful, but I think you guys understand what I'm saying here. Now, this particular mission school had many different students, but it started off small, like a lot of the schools. But I want to show you guys something here. Now, these four students that you're looking at are actually Hawaiian, right? Now, again, like I said, they were taking students who are non-Christian or from non-Christian cultures and getting them to learn Christianity. So when you look at these four youth, Thomas Hupu, I may be butchering the names, George Tamari, William Chinui, and John Honore, they look like what? They look like they are mixed race people, don't they? Or they look like what they would deem as mulattoes, but they were actually Hawaiian. Isn't that interesting? Okay. So now this particular student, George Tamari, I'll get into him in a little bit, but I want to backtrack a little bit now. The students that they had at the Foreign Mission School, I think that first year they only had like about 24 or so students, and they were from Hawaii, India, and East Asia, in addition to quote unquote Native American tribes, primarily those from east of the Mississippi River. So when you think about that, you are already seeing brown skinned students being taught westernized ways. Okay. So, of course, if you're seeing these students, do you make the distinction that they're free people of color, mulatto? Probably not. You're just saying, oh, okay, yeah, they're here to educate and to teach their people some things. But on the surface, they look like free people of color, right? Now, George Tamari in particular, oh, he's so fascinating. His father was King Kamalot. I won't even try to say it, you guys, because I'm going to totally butcher it. Totally butcher it. Now, he was the ruler of the islands of Kauai and the Hau. Ni Hau. I know I'm butchering it. Um, and the interesting thing about George Tamari was that he was of royalty, right? And I won't give you all the dynamics of his story, but it is incredibly, incredibly fascinating. And please read up on him. I will have links to his story too. But he's incredibly fascinating, incredibly fascinating. So now, here are other Indian and missionary schools prior to the Civil War that you see that were popping up in certain key places, like the Brainerd Mission School in Tennessee, Cornwall, Choctaw Academy, Cherokee Female Seminary, the St. Ignatius Mission School. Now, and you guys will learn more about all of these schools, I'm sure, in your research. But these were missionary schools. Okay, they were there to basically take the Aboriginals of the land or of their lands, or the and natives of their lands, and teach them Christianity. Okay, now we will fast forward to boarding schools. And there were a few notable ones that were actually orphans. They were orphanages. Now we have the Colored Orphan Asylum in New York. We have the St. Louis Colored Orphan Home in St. Louis. But of course, as we know, many of these, quote unquote, as we now know them, HBCUs, were starting and they were popping up in different places throughout the country. Wilberforce University in Ohio, Atlanta University, which was interestingly founded by American Missionary Association, again, those missionaries. 1866, there was Fisk, also known as the Fisk Free Colored School, again, founded by the American Missionary Association. And then we have more boarding schools, and you guys note these schools, and they were just popping up, all throughout the South. Lincoln University in Missouri. We had Augusta Institute, now later to become Morehouse College. Then there was Hampton University. Then you start seeing the Indian schools. The Carlisle Indian School was probably the most known one, which was in 1879. Okay. And then you had Forest Grove Indian Training School. Now keep in mind something. I'm going to go back a little bit. You saw the schools for the quote unquote African American pop up before the ones of the Native Americans. I'm just putting that out there, right? Everyone talks about the indigenous, but who were the indigenous? They were making schools for the African first before they made schools for the Native American. Just putting that out there. Of course, we know other boarding schools like Tuskegee, of course, founded by Booker T. Then there was Haskell Institute in Kansas. That was run and founded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Most of the Indian schools were run by the government. Most of them were run by the government. It's something to keep in mind too, right? So now we get to Julius Rosenwall. Julius Rosenwall, so fascinating figure. And again, I'm glossing over a lot of this stuff because it's so much to unpack, but I want to give you guys at least a cursory view as to who the players were so that you understand what was happening to us, right? So we go from the missionaries to now the boarding schools, and now we have Julius Rosenwall who comes in, and he is a Jewish American clothier who became part owner and president of Sears Roebuck and Company in 1895. And then he served as its president from 1908 to 1922 and was the chairman of its board of directors until his death in 1932. Okay. So Rosenwall was incredibly instrumental in funding more than 5,000 schools, shops, and teacher homes in the U.S., primarily for the education of Black children in the South during the early 20th century. And what he did was he set up a fund called the Rosenwald Fund. So those funds were used to build these schools all over the South. And some of these schools are still standing today. Now, again, who is that in the picture on the right? Booker T. Washington. And they worked really closely together to create the curriculum. Yeah, I haven't done a deep dive on Booker T. Washington as much as I could, but the more you see this, there's always someone from the quote unquote community working hand in hand with the agenda. Okay. Now, so from 1928 to 1948, the Rosenwall Fund Fellowship also gave grants to African American artists, scientists, and scholars. So, in addition to building all the schools that we saw in the South and shaping the minds of Black children, he also was giving money to artists and scientists and scholars who were Black, right? So, you basically have two classes of Black people he is giving money to. Now, of course, I look at Rosenwald. He looks like my light skinned uncle. I'm just keeping it 100. I'm just saying, putting that out there. Now, the fund that he had established was awarded to. He gave out basically 588 fellowships, and 222 of those were to white Southerners, primarily those involved in race relations. And so Edward Embry, the man that you see here on the left, the man that you see here on the left was one of those recipients of the fund. Okay. So yeah. Now, at the time of his death, Rosenwald had donated basically $50 million in $50 million towards all of his endeavors when it came to giving the fellowships in schools. I mean, he had spent basically close to $1 billion funding, African American education. Okay, so what you guys are seeing here is that people are pouring in a lot of money to teach us, quote unquote, black folks, right? They're pouring a lot of money, investing a lot of money into us, okay, to shape our minds. Okay, now remember, I'm going to go back to the Country School of Tomorrow. And what was one of the things that Frederick T. Gates had wrote? He said, "We are not to raise up from among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, and musicians." He said, "We're not going to do that." So when he was funding the elites, he was funding as they would have been called, the talented tenth, if you will. So Rosenwald was very, really specific on who he was going to give money to. Now, as you can see, these are the elite of the elite. We have heard all of these names: James Weldon Johnson, Marian Anderson, Charles S. Johnson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes. Like, we know these names. We know these names. But these were not these same people, right, who were poor, who were struggling, who were on farms. Now, some of these folks that we read about did come from poverty, absolutely, like Zora Neale Hurston. Some of them did come from poverty. But by the time they were being funded by Rosenwald, they had already established themselves as leaders in their community based on whether they were writers, as we call them now, thought leaders, social scientists. And for instance, John Hope Franklin he wrote the quote unquote Negro history book, right? So when you look at all of these folks that Rosenwald funded, these were um, they instrumentally changed the way that Black culture was shaped. I say shaped, yes, I do. So again, we have more fellows from, again, Ralph Bunche, Catherine Dunham. It's the elite of the elite, right? Jacob Lawrence, Gordon Parks, Ralph Ellison, Roscoe C. Brown Jr., like anybody that's anybody was funded by Rosenwald, the Black elite. You see how this works? So Rosenwald's funding the rural folk, the poor country folks, and he's also funding the Black elite. Now, I'm going to say something here. I'm going to make some connections because it has to be said. I don't know if anyone's ever said this before, but the destruction of the quote unquote Black towns. Now, I want to share something with you guys. Now, there has been some research that's been coming out, according to Simone Davis and Dr. I hope I'm saying her name correctly, Atya Martin of the Next Leadership Development. They have discovered that there were anywhere between 200 to 1,200 towns and settlements dating back as early as the 1600s. 200 to 1,200 towns and settlements, quote unquote, Black towns, which we all know those are actually indigenous. I mean, these are indigenous people. Now, Davis and Martin have been able to find records of more than 82 so far, which have been documented by scholars, historical societies, and government agencies. Okay, so keep this in mind, you guys. If we have our own settlements and towns, we've been doing that for some time. It's not something we just thought up and we just came from Africa, right? And we just have towns. No, these are indigenous people. These are indigenous people. And without looking at every single location, I can look at this map right here, just particularly just looking in North Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, Atlanta, Jacksonville, New Orleans. Like, these are not quote unquote African towns. These are indigenous people, right? Now, I'm going to show you guys something. Now, look at all of these towns that were destroyed or had some kind of racial tension where the towns were destroyed or burned down. Now, I put on the list here starting in New York. Now, of course, we know that these towns, all this started much earlier because we won't talk about the Indian Wars right now, but that's another topic. But look at all of these towns that were destroyed and look at the dates. Yeah, look at the dates. 1863, 1866, 1868, 1873. You're seeing a pattern here, right? Because think about this. If you have your own towns and you have your own communities and you're doing your own thing, it's really hard to re-educate you, isn't it? But those in power couldn't re-educate the American Indians if they have their own towns and settlements. So as they're building up all of these schools, they're also destroying the towns that we know. Think about that. I had to really wrap my head around that. I said, hold on a second. The dates, the timing of this is incredible. So if you burn down my town or you cause disruption in my community, what's the first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to try to figure out how to rebuild. And part of rebuilding means going to school, getting training, especially if that some of that training is free. Isn't that something? I just wanted to put that out there, you guys. And again, no one's going to write a book about this right now, or maybe it's been written, I haven't read it. But you have to really do incredible research to connect the dots. But I was just connecting the dots just by looking at this stuff here. Okay, so here are my final thoughts on all of this. And again, I know, guys, I went through this really quickly because a lot of this I want you guys to go and do your research and to really look at this information and to start really thinking about how we got here and how we were taught various things, but it had nothing to do with our culture and our heritage as American Indians, right? And so the title, of course, the presentation is You Were Never Black. But I'm showing you why that happened, why you believe that you're Black and why you believe you're African American, because that's what you were taught repeatedly, repeatedly. Okay. Now, one of the things about the GEB's fingerprints, it's all over the modern U.S. education system, right? While the names have changed, U.S. Department of Education, GEB, the foundational belief is still the same: centralized control, workforce preparation, differential education based on class and race, and compliance over curiosity. And these still shape the policies and priorities of today's public schools. Still. So if you're not taught anything about yourself or you're taught a very skewed view of your own history, you're going to keep repeating it. And everyone's going to push back on you because this is what they've been teaching you forever. They had to teach you the Bible, then they taught you to work the land, then they taught you, oh, you're a Negro, you're African. Now they're telling you still, this is how you're going to be educated, even in modern context. So with the dismantling of the US Department of Education, it's going to get really interesting because all those mandates are going to be gone. And now the states are going to individually have to figure out how to make sure that the students learn the ABCs and their 1, 2, 3s. But particularly for those who are Aboriginal American Indian, what does that mean for us? Well, it means a lot of different things. The what's next. So everything in the what's next is you unlearn and relearn what you've been taught. I mean, this is why I started the the channel, because I knew that for myself, I had to unlearn and relearn a lot of things, and it came so quickly and so fast. And part of it was me just having thoughts and me just saying, okay, let me get this out of me for right now. But then with my amazing friend Brian Isom Underwood, we've been able to have engaging conversations with people who are teaching us about, wow, everything that we thought we knew and didn't know. And I would highly encourage you guys to go look at the interviews we've done with Lisa Cypress, with Carrie Davis. Like, it's really great stuff here. So again, you have to unlearn and relearn what you've been taught. And you go back to studying original sources, those suppressed narratives, and dig in those national archives, because so much of this information is really right there in front of us. We just have to piece it together. And it's going to take some time. It's going to take a lot of time to unravel this. Also, build your own curriculum. Okay. Now, when I say build your own curriculum, this isn't just for you, the adult, but yes, for your children and your grandchildren. Start thinking about, how do we give our children additional information and to counter some of what they've been taught or not been taught in public schools. And to the public school credit, I'm a product of the public schools. Um, but most of what I learned that I found was really, really of value came from my mother saying, look, I need you to read this book, look at this, look at that, because there was so much information that the schools just couldn't teach. They don't even have the time. They just don't have the time. So there's going to be a lot more opportunities, I think, and room to homeschool our children. And we would probably have to start doing that anyway, because they're just not going to get everything that they need. Because once the funding gets cut off, the priorities are going to change, no doubt about that. And the biggest thing, and you guys know I preach this all the time, is you study and master your family story and genealogy, because that's everything. Because once you do that, no one can tell you who you are. No one can ever tell you that you're Black again, because you're going to know who you are and you're going to know your story. And who's going to really deny you your story? They can not like it, or they can say, "Oh, that's not true." But look, I can document pretty much everything that I know about my family. And if I can't document it, I park it. But I definitely am going to go somewhere and get information, right? So mastering that genealogy is going to make or break us, to be perfectly honest. So those are just my thoughts about the what's next for us as we navigate this educational system that will definitely be changing and is changing right now. So hopefully this was helpful for you guys, and it opened your mind and your eyes to some things. And I hope that you guys have some time to really do deeper dives into a lot of the information that we shared here in this video. And yes, look at the links that are in the description below. And please continue to like, share the content. We really appreciate you guys. And we will be talking to you soon. Thank you so much again. We appreciate you at the Hidden Histories Collective.